Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Blaise Misztal, a fellow at the Hudson Institute researching Turkey, terrorism, and the Middle East. Hello, Blaise, and thanks for joining us.
Hey, David, how are you?
Good, thank you. We are talking on Monday, November 4th. This past Saturday, U.S. forces visited the Syrian Kurdish militia known as the SDF or YPG in Kamishli in northeast Syria, and a source told Agence France Presse that the U.S. planned to set up a major military post there. Then the following day, Sunday evening, last night, there were reports that Turkey-backed rebels fired on a U.S. convoy near the town of Tal Tamr, about 25 miles from Kamishli. This follows an incident a couple weeks ago when Turkish forces fired on U.S. positions in Kobani. First, why do you think U.S. troops are meeting the SDF when they are supposed to be cutting those ties? And secondly, do you think these Turkey-backed rebels were sending a message to U.S. forces to clear out?
Well, I think, first of all, we're in a period of rather great ambiguity about the U.S. mission in Syria. President Trump originally said the United States was going to pull its troops first back from the Turkish-Syrian border, then out of northeastern Syria altogether. And then he said, no, in fact, they would be moving to western Iraq, but continuing the counterterrorism missions in Syria, and then that they would actually remain in some parts of northeastern Syria, particularly to guard the oil, as President Trump said it. And as of today, we in fact have more or less as many U.S. troops in northeastern Syria as there were before President Trump's withdrawal decision. And in fact, there is a transport of U.S. Armored fighting vehicles coming from Kuwait into northeastern Syria, which is actually an escalation in the type of firepower and personnel that the U.S. had in the territory. So things are changing in terms of both the U.S. mission and its presence and where it is.
Wait, just to be clear, you're saying that there's a convoy coming from Kuwait right now, and very soon, maybe this week, there will be a greater U.S. presence in northeast Syria than there was when Trump announced the pullout.
Equivalent, but sort of a higher level of firepower. Right before, we just had special forces troops stationed. Now there's armored fighting vehicles. There's talk of potentially sending tanks as well. So the situation is very fluid in terms of where the United States is and what it's doing. And I think this question of what its mission is not entirely clear. It does seem that what the United States wanted was to avoid a confrontation with Turkish troops. It did not necessarily want to end the counterterrorism partnership with the SDF. And I think now you have the situation where they're trying to balance those two. Clearly, as you said in your question, that friction with Turkish troops or Turkish-backed forces has materialized nonetheless. And I think is one of the reasons that you have seen the United States begin to change its thinking and begin to think that perhaps having northeastern Syria under Turkish control would not serve its greater objectives of making sure that ISIS doesn't return and that the region is stable and peaceful.
So you see these kind of interactions continuing, possibly increasing in the days ahead?
I think so, particularly when there's large ambiguity, when there's ambiguity as to Turkey's mission and objectives and how far it's going to push and whether it believes that the deals that it has struck with the United States and then Russia about moving the SDF out of the safe zone that Turkey desires, whether those conditions have been met, as long as there's ambiguity about the U.S. mission. I think it's entirely possible that Turkey feels like it has in some ways been once again betrayed or misled by the United States, which said it was pulling out, and yet suddenly here it is, and it's back, and it's in Kamishli and in other places that it thought the U.S. might leave, and that Turkey considers part of the safe zone that it wanted to occupy. So I think as long as there's ambiguity on both sides, there's going to continue to be these clashes because there's competing objectives and competing claims and competing operations going on.
Mm-hmm. Russia and Turkey have begun joint patrols of Turkey's so-called safe zone area in northeast Syria. You posed an interesting question on Twitter the other day, last week. What happens if these joint patrols encounter YPG fighters? Ankara and Moscow don't appear to have the same view of the YPG. So what do you think would happen?
I think that's a really tough question, and it's probably
But it is a possibility that they would run into YPG or SDF
absolutely,
fighters.
And I think that is a fundamental problem in the deal that Putin and Erdogan made, which refers back to the Adana Agreement, the 1998 agreement, in which Syria said that it would not host or enable operations of the PKK inside Syrian territory. And so this deal sort of that Putin and Erdogan made reaffirms the Adana Agreement. So it seems to suggest that Russia and Syria are now going to, in some ways, consider themselves responsible for eliminating the PKK, which obviously Turkey considers the YPG to be an extension of. Yet at the same time, Russia does not recognize the PKK as a terrorist group. It's not clear if they share the YPG PKK sort of formulation that Ankara is constantly putting forward. And really the deal seems to be more about the safe zone rather than the entirety of northeast Syria. So I think there's again a lot of ambiguities there. My sense is that the Russians are not going to be interested in any sort of armed conflict with Syrian Kurds. And in fact, if we think back to the 90s and to the precursor, what the situation was like before the 1998 Adana Agreement in Syria and Russia, and before it the Soviet Union, in fact, made common cause with Kurds and the PKK, and in fact found it strategically useful to have the insurgency going on inside Turkey. And so I think you're not going to see Syria and Russia really want to stamp out the YPG in the way that Turkey would want to. And I think in some time, whether that's now or in further down the road, they're probably going to be more willing to arm the YPG, more willing to support the PKK inside Turkey than the United States ever was. And so I think in the long term, Turkey is making its security situation on the Syrian-Turkish border worse, and it's actually creating the conditions to enable the very thing it wants to prevent, which is the further strengthening of the PKK.
Interesting. So, yeah, I mean, several analysts have said the most likely outcome for the YPG is to be integrated into Assad's forces, into the Syrian Arab army. But you're saying that even if that does happen, there'll still be the potential for the YPG to be armed, to sort of be revived and be armed against Turkey in some way down the line.
Absolutely. Look, there's no love lost between Assad and Erdogan. Erdogan came out strongly against Assad at the start of the conflict, has sort of pushed harder to get Assad out of power than anyone else, really. And even though you had some manner of Turkish reconciliation to Assad remaining in power through the Astana process, that's very grudging. And now you have Erdogan making territorial claims on Syria effectively, with the idea of the safe zone encroaching into Syrian territory. You still have Erdogan supporting Syrian opposition forces in Idlib, and it's presumed that he's going to maintain those ties. So if Erdogan maintains support for some sort of Syrian opposition in the form of the Syrian National Army or whatever else it comes to be called, it stands to reason that Assad will want to pay him back in kind, and have his own proxy force that he can deploy against Turkey, whether that's for the goal of pushing Turkey out of the safe zone or retribution inside Turkey itself. I think it stands to reason that is the most likely way that this will develop.
To continue with Russia-Turkey ties, just today, Monday, Turkey announced that the delivery of a second batch of Russian-made S-400 missile systems could be significantly delayed due to talks on technology sharing and joint production. What do you think this means exactly? And might this open the door for the U.S. to step in and replace the S-400s with Patriot missiles? Presidents Trump and Erdogan are, of course, planning to meet for talks next week.
I think that it is highly foreseeable that this would happen. One of Turkey's key demands around the purchase of a missile defense system has always been technology transfer and technology sharing, and is one of the reasons that Turkey has claimed that it cannot purchase an American or a European system, because American and European companies obviously do not want to share their intellectual property. But I think Erdogan was naive if he ever bought into Putin's claims that Russia would be willing to share that technology. Russia subsists off of two main exports right now. One is energy and the other is arms. And to think that they would share that technology and lower their competitiveness in terms of being able to export weapons is I think, far-fetched. But there's also, beyond that, there are other reasons why this might be happening, the slowdown in the transfer of the S-400s. One is Russia and Turkey are reportedly in talks to purchase for Turkey to purchase Russian Su-35 fighter jets to replace the F-35 that the United States is withholding from Turkey. So this might be leverage to try to get Turkey to finish that deal. It could be some form of leverage over ongoing issues in Syria, as we were just discussing. But it is hard to believe that this would really create a significant opening for the United States, insofar as the technology transfer piece remains a critical concern for Turkey that wants to jumpstart its own weapons industry. That's not going to be a concession so it's hard to imagine that this will create an opening for the United States to be able to supply Patriots to Turkey, insofar as technology transfer remains a key Turkish concern, insofar as they still want to use this to jumpstart their own weapons industry. That's not going to be a concession that the United States is going to ever be willing to make. Obviously, they can negotiate on price and other things. But if Turkey continues to insist on technology transfer, it's not going to get it from the United States. Now, if Turkey realizes it's not going to get it from Russia either, and sort of relinquishes that demand, then perhaps there's still a deal to be made. But then they already have the S-400, so it's hard to imagine that really the Patriot is still a viable option here.
You don't think it is? I mean, some say that Turkey might never flip the switch on the S-400. They could mothball them. They could send them to a third country. You don't think that's a possibility any longer?
Certainly, it's always a possibility. It just seems like it would be very hard for the United States to give Erdogan enough for him to be able to claim this as a victory and say, we ended up in a better and stronger position and got everything we wanted from the United States by doing this. Especially given the current tensions, particularly given the atmosphere in Congress, which is increasingly opposed to Erdogan, I can't imagine that sort of deal coming together now.
Returning to the fight against terrorism in northeast Syria, Turkey is expected to soon take control of some of the 30,000 or so ISIS detainees in northeast Syria. And on Monday, Turkey's interior minister said the country would soon start sending these foreign ISIS fighters back to their countries of origin, even if those countries had revoked their citizenship. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, that's a really interesting claim by the Turkish government, and it's hard to see how that is anything more than an extension of the sort of the blackmail that Turkey has been engaging with on Syrian refugees. So we've obviously heard Erdogan say before that he'll open the floodgates and send 3 million Syrian refugees into Europe, as sort of Turkey was doing in 2015. And this seems like a similar move, because largely the sort of remaining foreign fighters that countries are revoking citizenships of are formerly Europeans. Obviously, there's a large number of nationalities represented among the ISIS fighters, but other countries have been taking them back at greater or slower paces, including the United States. The ones that are mostly remaining are either European or Russian. It's hard to imagine that Erdogan would really send Putin a big gift of ISIS fighters when he doesn't want to take them. So this is really a veiled threat against the European countries. And I imagine it's in order to both extract concessions and try to break some of the animosity we've seen from Europeans in the wake of the Turkish invasion of northeastern Syria.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Turkey and ISIS, after the killing of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi last week, you tweeted this. So Turkey claims it needs to go into northeast Syria to get terrorists, and it turns out that terrorist enemy number one, al-Baghdadi, was in Turkish-supported Idlib province. That's inconvenient, you said. Were you, like many others, suggesting Turkey knew more than it had let on? Perhaps Baghdadi's hideout, perhaps more?
I am not privy to any information that would suggest that Turkey was in any way aware of or complicit in Baghdadi's presence in Idlib province, or the presence of his number two that was killed several days later in Jarablus. It certainly raises that question, and I think there's been reporting that the United States is reviewing the intelligence that it gathered from those raids to establish who knew what when. But I think it poses the bigger question is that Turkey makes all these demands about needing to protect itself from the PKK-YPG, this great terrorist threat that exists on its border in northeast Syria and southeast Turkey, but yet seems completely blind to the existence of any other form of terrorism.
Which is interesting because Turkey was, of course, the victim of a handful of major ISIS attacks in the last few years.
That's right. Although I think it's important also to remember the sequence of those attacks, and the first several ISIS attacks that occurred inside Turkey were actually committed by Kurdish ISIS members against predominantly Kurdish targets, more in retribution, at least I think in Turkey's mind, for the operations of the YPG than for anything else. So I think as long as it was sort of ISIS targeting Turkish Kurds, Erdogan didn't really seem to see that as a threat to Turkey. It's only when you had the attacks in Ankara and the Istanbul airport that seemed to change. Yet at the same time, there's reporting that there's ISIS cells existing inside Turkey to this day. Certainly, Turkey was very lax in allowing most of these foreign jihadists to travel through Turkey to get to Syria, the very same ones that they're now going to be sending back, apparently, in some cases. And we also know that MIT, the Turkish intelligence organization, appeared to be sending trucks full of weapons, not necessarily to ISIS, but to other terrorist groups inside Syria as part of its effort to fight the Assad regime. And so, there's a certain myopia in the Turkish government about who is really a terrorist. And I think the fact that it has this terrorist presence in territories that it has some control over, in the form of Baghdadi, in the form of HTS and other terrorist groups that still operate in Idlib, shows that this argument that it's all about the YPG, and Turkey is just laser focused on terrorism, and that's all it cares about, and just protecting itself against this one threat. It shows how morally bankrupt that argument is.
So where does that leave us in terms of putting the lid on a possible ISIS insurgency? Many had worried that with the YPG now out of the fight, there was a good chance that ISIS could return because, as you say, Turkey has been less than stellar, let's say, in fighting ISIS.
Certainly, this is an opportunity for ISIS to perhaps not reconstitute itself, but regain some of its strength. And we've certainly seen an uptick in ISIS attacks in the time since the United States began its withdrawal. It's hard to imagine that this will create room for ISIS to regain the sort of territorial caliphate that it never had. And certainly, given the sort of the change in leadership that has to happen right now, I think ISIS will largely remain on the back foot. I think there's two bigger issues. One is when it comes to terrorism. One is what happens with Idlib province. There is a well-organized terrorist group in the form of HTS that is in control of that territory, that enjoys some manner of relationship and support from Turkey. That province is under pressure from Syrian and Iranian forces right now. Where do they go? And what does the relationship between Turkey and them look like? I think that is going to really have an impact on the course of terrorism in the region. And the other, in the longer term, is if you think back to the conditions that allowed ISIS to emerge in the first place, which was sort of sectarian oppression by the Maliki government in Iraq prior to 2014, and the start of the civil war in Syria. Are we going to have a return to that? Are we going to have a return of sort of Shiite oppression of Sunnis, whether that's in northeastern Syria and western Iraq, to the point that they're going to decide to rise up again, and potentially the return of Assad's rule to northeastern Syria, the deeper embedding of Iranian forces there, could create those conditions, not today, not next week, but in a couple of years once again.
Speaking of new conditions, you mentioned this recent Trump position that the 200 or so U.S. troops staying in northeast Syria will not be there to fight wars or battle terrorism, but to protect Kurd-controlled oil installations. Analysts I've spoken to have said it's pretty much delusional, this agenda, and likely not the troops' real mission there. What do you think?
Well, certainly part of the problem with the U.S. presence in Syria over the last 5 years, and I think one of the reasons why President Trump grew frustrated with it and made the decision to withdraw twice, once in December of 2018 and now just recently, is because the United States hasn't really always been honest with itself about what those troops are doing there. Certainly defeating ISIS was a big part of that mission, and that was finally accomplished with the dismantlement of the caliphate in March of this year. But I think it's always been about a bigger strategic geopolitical game of chess going on with Iran. And some members of the administration have been more forthright about that. John Bolton, when he was National Security Advisor, said the U.S. is not pulling troops out of Syria until every last Iranian soldier has left, and made it clear that there's a bigger game afoot. But the Department of Defense has resisted that, and so this has nothing to do with Iran, even at a time when U.S. forces killed 200 Russian mercenaries and were pushing back against Iranian proxies and trying to intercept some of the smuggling of weapons and technology that was going on from.
And while the U.S. is sending more troops to Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. So whether it's within the government or between the government and the public, I think there is a lack of forthrightness about what the objective is. And you saw this a little bit in the press conference that Secretary of Defense Mark Esper had recently, where he was asked about basically the rules of engagement of these troops that are guarding the oil and who they're holding it for and who they're authorized to shoot at. And he basically ended up having to admit this isn't just about keeping ISIS from grabbing these oil fields. It's about keeping the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians from grabbing these oil fields as well. But that isn't a very clearly articulated U.S. goal right now. What that strategy for pushing Iran out of Syria isn't clear as well. And I think that's part of what's fueling this confusion about why are we in Syria? How long are we going to be in Syria? What parts of Syria are we in? And that's really something that this administration, I think, needs to clear up.
But you think it's to some extent obfuscation rather than a lack of a coherent policy?
Actually, I don't think so. I mean, Aaron Stein had a great piece in War on the Rocks, I believe it was last week, in which he argued that Trump has sort of been ill-served by his bureaucracy by his policymakers, and there's reporting in Foreign Policy about sort of how the Iran hawks fought to keep the U.S. troops in Syria after President Trump made the decision to withdraw in December of last year. And I think that paints a pretty interesting picture, which is there are parts of the administration and the bureaucracy that have a very clear objective of countering Iran's influence and presence across the region from this strategic sliver of territory in northeast Syria. But they haven't necessarily made that clear even to the president, let alone the public, perhaps out of concerns that the president wouldn't go along with it, perhaps out of concerns that this needed to be a more covert operation, but certainly without the president and the public fully understanding why we were there and what we were doing, if in fact it was as much to counter Iran as to counter ISIS, then people were left without the understanding of why we should still be there if ISIS has been defeated.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned Aaron Stein. He told me last week that Erdogan is able to influence and manipulate Trump, and that when the two meet, Trump generally capitulates to Erdogan's view. The two are set to meet next week and sure to talk about most of these issues we've mentioned. How do you see that going? And do you think they'll also discuss the recent U.S. sanctions on Turkey and the U.S. House passing this Armenian genocide bill?
Yeah, the Trump-Erdogan relationship is a fascinating one, and it's been something that I think people were speculating about from the moment that Trump was elected as to how these two leaders would get along. Certainly, in a lot of instances, Erdogan has been able to get what he wants from President Trump, but I think to say that he's able to coerce Trump or able to sort of talk him into doing whatever he wants isn't quite right. And when you look at the evidence, when you look at the sanctions that were put in place over the negotiations to get Pastor Andrew Brunson out of Turkey, some of the tweets that President Trump put out, both about the S-400 deal and then sort of following the U.S. withdrawal and trying to limit Turkey's invasion of northeastern Syria, it's not clear that Trump backs Erdogan on everything. Quite the opposite. There are sources of tension. And I find it hard to believe as well that Erdogan is able to make Trump back down on things, right? So the phone call that happened that got President Trump to withdraw troops, I find it hard to believe that was Erdogan saying, Turkish forces are going in, we're going to kill American troops if you don't get out of the way. You guys better leave. President Trump does not like to be told what to do. He does not like to be seen as weak. I don't think that would actually work with him. I think what is actually happening is that President Erdogan is really good at reading Trump's instincts, at reading sort of Trump's or appealing to Trump's gut. So I think what you have more likely happening is that Erdogan says, look, I know, Trump, that you really want to end these endless wars. You did a great job fighting ISIS. You killed them. You got them. They're done. Why do you still have troops in Syria? Bring them home. I know that's what you want to do. And if you're worried about ISIS coming back, then, Turkey will shoulder that burden and will help you achieve this. So I find it more likely that Erdogan is really able to speak Trump's language on some of these issues, rather than coercing him or just being, fully simpatico with him.
Kind of the same thing. I guess the question is, have we ever seen the reverse? We often seem to see Trump come out of their meetings parroting Erdogan's line, but have we ever seen the reverse? Have we ever seen Erdogan tilt toward Trump?
No, I think we haven't really seen that. And it's an interesting question as to whether that is because Trump hasn't really made any major asks. Sort of the only concession he got was the release of Pastor Brunson, or because he lacks the carrots and the sticks to get Erdogan to sort of buy the American line on any of these things. But I think certainly, while it's not sort of a complete ability on Erdogan's part to bend Trump to his will, he has to feel good about his ability to push his agenda. And I think if there is a meeting on November 13th, Erdogan is going to come with a long list of demands, and will try to get more concessions out of President Trump. The one thing that I think was going to be top of that list is going to be the indictment that has come down against Halkbank, which has the potential to really damage Turkey's economy if this case goes forward. And I would imagine he'll be interested in trying to pressure President Trump to have that case dismissed.
Okay. Well, good luck to Trump. Blaise Misztal, thanks so much for joining us, a fellow at the Hudson Institute. Thanks for your insight and time.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure.